this podcast is going to be about the Chartists. So in other words, it's give us the vote. So just so we make it clear here, the backdrop to what was happening with the Chartist movement is quite straightforward. This is men of all classes wanting the vote. So in the early 1800s, there was absolutely no secret ballots whatsoever. And the problem was elections were only once every 7 years. So the voting system was pretty corrupt and it really needed sorting out. And another reason why it was corrupt was that people could represent rotten boroughs. So the rotten boroughs were places that weren't really real. So people could represent like 2 cows and a sheep, or they could represent a mound of land. So in terms of this, that wasn't how it should work. And places like Birmingham didn't have any MPs. And all the people who were MPs at the beginning of the 1800s were rich. And that had to happen because there was no pay for being a member of Parliament. So obviously the rich people could afford to be MPs, but the poor working class and the low middle class and things definitely couldn't. So something needed to be done in terms of reforming the voting system. So what happened then in terms of the Chartist movement? Well, we can't just jump in with the People's Charter and the people who became the Chartists. There'd obviously been things that had happened before to try and get people to vote. And one of these was the Great Reform Act. So in 1832, the Great Reform Act eventually got through Parliament, but it took 3 times to get it through. That's why it was called Great, because it took so long to actually get it through Parliament. And what happened with it is the working class were really disappointed with this Great Reform Act, because the idea was it was meant to be giving, everybody the vote, but the working class absolutely didn't get the vote from the Great Reform Act. What happened was it was the people who were the rich and the upper middle class shook hands above the people who were low middle class and the working class and left them out completely of being able to get the vote. So there was things that got brought in to be able to vote, like property restrictions. You had to earn £150 more a year, £150 or more a year. So obviously that meant that it was difficult for anybody who was low and middle class or working class to get the vote. And in the end, only 1 in 7 men actually got the vote after the Great Reform Act. So it certainly wasn't what had been promised for everybody. And another problem with it was the Great Reform Act was something that was meant to be this big bit of legislation that was going to be, groundbreaking and changing for like all these people to get the vote. But actually, in all honesty, only about 650,000 people had the vote after the Great Reform Act. So in terms of, representation of the whole country, well, this was absolutely nowhere near representation for the whole country. And as well, there was still no secret ballots. So what that meant was, if you wanted to keep your job and things, so you work for a factory owner, and just say you're in the middle class, you'd feel that you had to vote for your factory owner. So really, although it was seen as like the Great Reform Act, the working class mocked it and were like, how is it great? Like, what has it possibly done for us? Okay, so that was really a bit of a failure in terms of people trying to get the vote. But there was some movement forwards, but there was still a long way to go. Now, the next thing that is important as well is what happens in 1859 at Peterloo, or in other words, it's St Petersfield in Manchester. So, men, women and children went out for the day. A lot of them took picnics and things. It was going to be a family outing. And what they wanted to do, they wanted to listen to this man called Henry Hunt, who was a really good, orator or public speaker. And he was talking to them about how they could try and, get the vote, because obviously people still wanted representation in Parliament. Because remember, all these people are being taxed, but they're not actually represented, which is a major problem. So, 100,000 people are in St Petersfield in Manchester, and the local magistrates panic a bit, and they send out the militia, which is the local army, to try and restore order, even though it wasn't out of control, there was just a lot of people there. Now, the militia had a bit of a drink, unfortunately, and what happened was they started killing people. So 11 people died, more of those died later of the people that were injured, and 500 were injured. And then the government brings in a law that there can't be any public gatherings of more than 50 people. So in terms of that, it was panic from the authorities, but it actually showed, they were trying to not let the working class know how they were possibly going to be able to get a vote. So that was a real shame in terms of that. Now, on to the actual Chartist movement then. So, What they came up with, this group of people, okay, Chartists, was the People's Charter. And they came up with 6 demands in terms of what they actually wanted. Now, it's important for you to realise these demands are significant, but you wouldn't need to write every single one in the exam, but if you can remember a few, that'd be really helpful. So the first one was votes for all men. Now, originally they were going to say votes for all, but they were so worried that they would be laughed out if they said about votes for women, because women weren't really represented very well at all at this point, that they just went for votes for all men. Also, equal sized constituencies. So it shouldn't be that, you know, somewhere like Birmingham has no MPs, yet a mound of grass has 2 MPs. That was ridiculous. So they wanted everywhere to have the certain, you know, same amount of MPs. So that was another thing. They also wanted voting in secret, and the reason why the voting in secret was going to be important was because then you could vote for who you wanted to vote for and not necessarily your factory owner. Another one was wages for MPs, because it will always be the rich people who are MPs if people don't have, you know, money in terms of becoming an MP. Because how can a working class person give up the job in a factory and then not get paid for being an MP? So that was significant as well. They also wanted no property qualifications, and what I mean by that is it shouldn't be compulsory to own property or earn over £150 a year or anything like that. That's really important that that's not specifically there. And also they wanted an election every year. So those were the 6 things they put on the People's Charter. So what they did was they constantly went back and forwards in terms of going to Parliament, you know, demanding, you know, representation, and they wanted these things. And the People's Charter started really in the 1830s. So, you know, it was after the Great Reform Act, but one of these things had gone to Parliament, you know, before Peterloo and things like that. And they were just trying as much as they possibly could to get people to recognise, basically, you know, the plight that they were in and that they wanted the vote. Now, a lot of these had like up to 3 million signatures and things on it, but it didn't mean to say that Parliament would move on it just because 3 million people had signed it. So they were always fairly disappointed with the reaction, you know, that they got. So in the end, the Chartist movement became a bit divided. So there was Lovett, who was all about peaceful ways of being able to get the vote, and there was O'Connor, who wanted to use moral force, or another way of putting that is a little bit more sort of militant, violent force, really. So it's a bit like the civil rights movement, there was a bit of a split. So constantly, what you found was Lovett went backwards and forwards with these petitions to Parliament. You know, he encouraged people to do speeches and things, and he wanted people to, you know, like sort of have their say, but he just absolutely thought they should stay away from violence. But when another petition failed of Lovett's, what some of the Chartists decided to do in Newport, Wales, was rise up, because they wanted to be like more militant and more violent. And it was so worrying this that actually Queen Victoria got moved to the Isle of Wight for a little bit because they were worried what could happen to her. And 22 in that Newport Rising were actually killed. So things did get a little bit militant under the Chartists. And also another thing was when another petition went to Parliament, but that also failed, people then really massively started to turn towards O'Connor's methods of moral force. So they started doing things like the plug plot. So the plug plot is where they used to pull the plugs out of the machines to sabotage them, so then obviously, you know, they couldn't do the work in the factories. Also they used to throw paint into the machines and things, so that obviously, you know, there was no way that the machines would work. So what happened was the people in the factories, and not just the factories, but that's a good example, most factory workers that were men would be Chartists, because they're not represented. It's a terrible time to live in the 1800s, and they want some sort of say. So that's what they end up doing. So just so that we're clear on that, the Chartists, obviously there was hundreds of thousands of them really, you know, if not millions, because these were the people who were obviously not happy whatsoever with what they'd got, basically. They wanted more rights. So what was the significance then of the Chartist movement? Well, they were absolutely hugely significant, the Chartists, because on that People's Charter, this was the people trying to get some power, saying this is what we would like, this is what we want. But the movement became divided, as I said, between Lovett and O'Connor. And something else that's important as well, many of the people who were the Chartists became involved at the same time in the trade union movements, which I'll do a podcast later on about, and then you can have a look at that. Something else as well was the Chartists ended up scaring the government purely because they could mobilise huge groups of people, which always scared the government, and also they had respectable leaders. So they had middle class leaders like Lovett and O'Connor. These weren't people to be laughed at. It's a bit like with the suffragette movement when they had, Millicent Fawcett and Emmeline Pankhurst. These were well respected people, so that always made them fear it. Another thing that happened with the Chartists as well, to try and put them off continuing doing, what they were trying to do, get the vote, they sent a lot of them to Australia, so there was a lot being transported to Australia to scare them. Now, unfortunately, the end of the Chartist movement, and I say the end, but it's not completely, because in the long term it does do really well, but they take another petition to Parliament in the 1850s, and this time it's got around 2 million signatures on it. And O'Connor and some Chartists meet outside of London, and they're all going to go in and give the petition in, but they won't let all those people go in because they're worried about violence. So O'Connor takes it into Parliament himself, and it basically gets laughed out of Parliament because a lot of the signatures on there are signed Queen Victoria. Now, you and I both know the reason for that is they don't want their employers and things to know that they've signed it in case they get sacked from the jobs. But it makes it look like, somebody signed it as if like Mickey Mouse or something like that. They're just taking the mick. It's like they think that they've just made these people's names up, where actually they probably haven't. So it looks like the Chartist movement, as died a death and all come to an end. But actually, the important thing to remember for this is what the Chartists have put in place is that the working classes wanted to have some sort of voice and be able to get some political representation. And by 1918, 5 out of those 6 things on the People's Charter had actually been achieved, and the only one that didn't achieve was, an election every year. That's still not there today, and we can sort of understand why that wouldn't work really. And also, in terms of me telling you in class about 1928, you can also mention 1928, because really there was women who joined the Chartist movement who obviously didn't get anything out of it because they didn't get the vote through the Chartist movement. But by 1928, all women had equal voting rights to men as well. So yes, the suffragettes did that as well, but in terms of everybody being represented, by 1928 everybody was represented in Parliament, and this is a major step forwards. So 1918, okay, when the Chartists really got what they wanted eventually in the long run, that is known as the Representation of the People's Act, because this is when all men got the vote, but women who were obviously over the age of 30 plus started to be represented in terms of vote as well.